Hello. This is Mr. Math, your chess instructor. In this video, we'll be going over King and Pawn Endgames. Specifically, we'll be talking about two important King and Pawn Endgame concepts. We'll then see how we can use those two concepts to deduce how to play optimally in all basic King and Pawn Endgames. And once we know that, we'll build further on that by using that knowledge to be able to predict the outcome of any basic King and Pawn Endgame that we're put in front of during a game. So, as mentioned, we'll be going over two main concepts, and those are the square rule and opposition. We'll start with the former. The square rule states that in a race between a pawn trying to queen and a king trying to stop the pawn, the king will only be able to stop the pawn if it's inside a certain square. This square is formed by counting the number of squares from the pawn to the queening square, and then using that as one edge of the square, allowing us to draw the other edges of equal length. So here, for example, White's pawn has 4 moves to get to h8, so we'll draw that side of the square, and then 4 steps to the left, and we'll continue 4 down, and 4 back to where we started. So now we have a 5 by 5 square, and it's bound by h4, h8, d8, and d4 as its vertices. Notice that the black king is not currently in the square, but if this position is black's move, it could very well step into the square. As a result, if it's white's move in this position, white will win because the pawn will not be stopped as the king is not currently in the square. Whereas if it's black's move in this position, black will be able to stop the pawn and create a draw because the king will be able to step into the square and reach the pawn in time. And we can go ahead and test this. So with white to move, there's h6, king d6, h6, king 7, h7, king f7, and we promote on the next turn, most likely to a queen, and white wins. Going back, if this was black to move, we can start with king d6, stepping into the square, and now h5, king 7, h6, king f7, h7, king g7, and notice that black stays in the square right up until the end, and as white promotes to a queen, black will be able to capture it. The second concept we need to know is called opposition. Opposition occurs when the kings face each other like so. When the kings face each other like this, whoever it is to move is at a disadvantage, and whoever it is not to move is at an advantage. As a result, the player who doesn't have to move is said to have the opposition. I know that might have been a little confusing, so let me repeat it again. The player whose move it is in this situation is at a disadvantage. The other player is therefore at an advantage and has the opposition. Let's take this position as an example. Let's say that white's goal is to get the king all the way to the 8th rank of the board, and black's goal is simply to stop white's king from doing so. If it's white's turn here, black has the opposition. Why? Well, let's see what white can do to progress. So it's white's turn. They can't step forward because black's king covers all of the advancing squares, so they can only step to the side. And then it's black's turn, so they can slide in the same direction to continue to prevent white's king from moving forward. And we can repeat this process infinitely over and over again. And what we see is that white has no way to progress, and this will repeat indefinitely as a result, and black will successfully be able to stop white's king from getting all the way to the 8th rank. But now let's take a look at the opposite case. What would happen if it was black's turn? Well, in that case, white has the opposition, and white has the advantage. Why? Well, if it's black's turn, they'll have to move their king. However, if they say step to the left here, white's king will be able to invade on the right side and eventually reach the end. So for example, king f7, or king f5, king e7, king g6, king f8, king h7, and black cannot stop the white king from going to h8 on the next turn. Similarly, if black were to step to the other side, white also gets all the way there, king d5, king 7, king c6, king d8, king b7, and again, white will be able to reach to 8th rank on the next turn. So as a result, going back, in this position where the kings face each other, whoever has to make a move with their king is at a disadvantage, and whoever doesn't have to move has the advantage and has the opposition. Now we'll do our first puzzle, which is a famous study by historical player Reddy. In this position, we're playing as white, and it's our move. Both sides need to race to promote their pawns. However, Preliminary glance at the position using the square rule shows that our situation as white is quite bleak. Black's king is within the square of our pawn, but our king is not within the square of their pawn. So the question is, despite this, how can we try to make a draw? Even though there are only 4 pieces on the board, this puzzle can be deceptively hard. So take your time, pause the video, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, so we have 2 ways of playing for a draw here. Option 1 is to stop Black's pawn from promoting, resulting in an endgame with just the 2 kings on the board, which would be a draw. Option 2 is to try and promote at the same time that Black promotes, which will result in both players having a queen, which is also a draw. However, it's not clear how we can do either of those things. For example, if we start with pawn to c7, Black can simply catch up with their king to do the square rule, and we won't be able to promote safely. Similarly, again, the square rule means that we also will be able to catch up the Black's pawn. For example, if we play king h7 here, going after the pawn h4, king h6, h3, and it's just going to keep running. But besides catching up to their pawn, there's one more thing that our king can try to do, and that's to support our own pawn's promotion, defending it from the Black king. If our king also enters the square of the pawn from the other side, our king will still be able to mirror our opponent's king and support the pawn towards making a queen. Even still, our opponent's king is far closer to our pawn rather, than our king is. But now we can realize something. What happens if we try to do both things at the same time? And thus, our first move is king g7, stepping both towards our pawn and our opponent's. Let's first see what happens if our opponent tries to push the pawn all the way to make their queen, h4. We'll continue with king f6, h3, and now we can step into the square of our pawn with king e6, h2, c7, and now we can see that if our opponent makes a queen, we'll also make a queen with check. And so our opponent needs to try and stop us, king b7, but king d7, and our king is also in the square of the pawn, and therefore it's going to be able to help support it and make a queen. So going back, what if Black had tried to take our pawn instead of trying to promote, and they led off with king b6 instead of h4? Well, we can continue our idea of doing both things at the same time with king f6. Now, we're threatening to enter Black's pawn square on the next turn with either king f5, g5, or e5, and so they cannot take the pawn, they must push. And now we can play king e5, again, threatening to enter Black's pawn square, while still also threatening to enter the square of our pawn on the next turn. And of course, we see that Black cannot deal with both. On the next turn, we either enter our pawn square and promote, or we'll be able to enter their pawn square if they take our pawn. Either way, we make a draw. Good job if you found that. For our next 2 sections, we'll be applying the concept of opposition to a very common endgame scenario, when both players have traded off everything except for one pawn. We've already mentioned that we can use the square rule to determine whether or not the defender's king is in range to potentially stop a pawn, as well as whether or not the attacker's king is in range to support the pawn. But now we'll be using the principle of opposition to see what happens if both kings are in the square of the pawn. We'll be starting in the situation where the attacker's king is in front, or rather the attacker's pawn is in front, my apologies, and the king is supporting the pawn from behind. In this scenario, regardless of who is to move, with perfect play, the result is a draw. Let's see what happens if white tries to make progress. Let's say they're first to move, king d1, and black must now step backwards, since the pawn covers all sideways movements. So let's say king e4, king d2, and now black can take the opposition with king d4, and we see that white's king cannot move forward. Of course, if it steps backwards, black will simply step back into king e3, and we're going to repeat moves. So white's only option is to play e3, pushing the pawn. Black can now play king e4, king e2, and we've repeated the position with all pieces having moved up 1 square. And so this process will repeat over and over again up until the pawn gets to the 6th rank. My apologies. Now here, in this position, we have the critical moment of the endgame. Black has three lethal moves, King D8, King E8, and King F8. Now, I already told you at the start of this endgame that it should be a draw, but now Black must play accurately to prove it. So, which of these three moves draws, or do multiple moves draw? Make sure you think about the principle of opposition while calculating. Pause the video, take your time, and unpause when ready. Okay, let's tackle this puzzle by using opposition. Remember, if the kings face each other, whoever it is to move is at a disadvantage. If we were to take away the white pawn here, we see that in the current situation, with white to move, white would have the opposition. If king d8, then king d6 would keep the opposition for white. If king e8, king e6 would, and if king f8, king f6 would. However, there is a pawn on e6, and as a result, only one of black's moves denies white the ability to take opposition, and that's king e8, and that's the only move that draws. Why? Because now white cannot regain opposition due to the pawn being in the way, and if white plays king d6, or king f6 for that matter, black can now take the opposition, king d8. And after e7 check, king e8, white will be forced to either leave the defense of the pawn or stalemate with king e6. Either way, black draws. Now, let's see what would have happened if we handed over the opposition to white. For example, if we had started with king d8, white can now play king d6, king e8, e7, and now we have the same position, but it's our move as black. And so we're forced to play king f7, and after king d7, white's king will be able to support the pawn and make a queen. So as you can see, king e8 was the only move to draw, and that was because it was the only move that allowed black to gain the opposition. Now that we've seen why the situation where the attacker's pawn in front of the king is a draw, now let us analyze the situation where the attacker's king is in front of their pawn. Again, we can use the principle of opposition to guess at the potential results of this position. If it's white to move, black has the opposition and should have the advantage. If it's black to move, white has the opposition and should have the advantage. Let's start with a scenario where it's white to move. Due to the opposition, white cannot advance with their king. So they'll be forced to move to the side, let's say with king d4. Now black can simply maintain the opposition with king d6, and we can see that white cannot make any progress with the king by itself. White's only other option is to move the pawn, but after e4, king 6, e5, we've ended up in a scenario with the pawn in front of the king, which as we previously have discussed, is a draw. However, you may have noticed that after e4, white temporarily has the opposition in this position. While it didn't help white here, had our pawns started on e5, with the kings on e6 and e8 instead, this would have been a win. So for example, once we can see now that after king d6, king d8, e6, white has the opposition, and after king e8, e7, black is forced again to play king f7, and white will win. So if the pawn starts in front of in the fifth rank, and the kings are both in front of the pawn, it's always a win for the attacking side, even if they don't have the opposition. Okay, so now let's go back and see what would have happened if it was black to move. In this case, white would have the opposition. Black will start by stepping to the side, since they unfortunately can't pass their turn. And now white can push forward on whatever side black isn't on. In this case, that would be king f5. Of course, if black plays king d5, white can start to push the pawn forward with e4. Now if king d7, king e5, king e7, black temporarily gains the opposition, but of course white can now take it back with e4, resulting in a repetition of position, except with all the pieces moved up one square. A similar story would have happened after king e7, king e5, with repetition of the position. White can continue to use their advantage of opposition to eventually reach the position where their pawn reaches the fifth rank. At that point, if black has the opposition, white still wins due to the reasons we described earlier. And if white has the opposition, black will be forced to give white's king control of the remainder of the pawn's path. So if we go back to this position, for example, and say it's white's opposition and it's black's move, once they step out, king f7, and White's king now covers all of the remaining squares for the pawn, and white will make a queen. And so we have our conclusion. When the attacker's king is in front of the pawn, it's a win if the attacker has the opposition, and it's a draw if the defender has the opposition. Now, let's use what we've learned to analyze the following position. Here, we're going to need to understand the concept of distant or extended opposition. The idea that opposition doesn't just apply when the kings are facing each other with one square between them, but that opposition works as long as there's an odd number of squares between the king. So not just one square, but also 3 squares or 5. Again, whoever it is to move in such a scenario is at a disadvantage. With that in mind, can you use distant opposition to determine the outcome of this position if it's black to move? How about white? Take your time, think about it carefully, then check your work by seeing what happens when the kings meet each other in the middle and close the gap. Pause the video and unpause when you're ready. Alright, let's start with what happens if it's black's turn. Here, there are 6 squares between the kings, and therefore, black can immediately take distant opposition with king e7, making the number of squares between the kings 5. Of course, white's only chance to win is to get the king in front of the pawn, so king d2. Now black can play king d6, and again, we have distant opposition. The number of squares between the kings is 3. Black again has the opposition, king e3, king e5, and we see that black was able to maintain opposition the whole way through, and this allows them to draw. But okay, if black is to move in this position, they can take opposition and it's a draw. What if it's white to act? Well, they can't immediately take the opposition with king e2, and king d1 will result in king d7, with black again taking the opposition because there are 5 squares between the kings. So, if white is to make progress, they have to step forward. Let's say king d2. Now, if king d7, then king d3, and there are now 3 squares between the kings, and white has taken distant opposition, king e6, king e4, and white will win because white retains the opposition and has the king in front of the pawn. But going back, after king d2, what if black had started with king d8, you might ask? Now there are 5 squares between the kings, and therefore black has control of the opposition. But let's see what happens. King d3, king d7, black keeps the opposition, king e4, king e6, black continues to keep the opposition. But now, although black has the opposition here, we see that black doesn't get to keep it. White can move the pawn, e3, and now white retakes the opposition. And as a result, since it's black's turn in this position, white will end up winning. Great job if you saw all of those lines. Now for the rest of this video, we'll be going over some King and Pawn Endgame scenarios where a quick glance with the rules we talked about in this video don't give you the right answer immediately for some other reason. And we'll be starting with the scenario where the attacking pawn has 2 pawns on the same file, also known as doubled pawns. Here, we see that white's king is behind the pawn, and so this should be a draw. However, after king e8, king d6, king d8, we see that white, even though black has the opposition, white can grab the opposition here with e5. And now after king e8, e7, king f7 is forced, king d7, and white will be able to promote. As a general rule then, we can say that if there are 2 or more pawns, the attacker always wins, except, no, there are still oppositions to even that rule. Firstly, if the pawns are doubled on the 5th and 6th rank, it's still a draw. So for example, king e8, king d6, king d8, and now we see that there's no move to make to gain opposition like white had previously. White's only option is to play e7 check, king e8, and of course now either e6 or king e6 would both be stalemates, and retreating would give black the pawn, and white's king would no longer be in front of his own pawn. And secondly, if all the pawns are on the A or H files on the edge of the board, no matter how many pawns the attacker has, or if the attacker has opposition, the defender can always draw by planting the king on the queening square, in this case h8. And if we push the pawns all the way, we can see why. So let's say it's black's turn here, king g8, king h7 check, king h8. And there is no flanking place on the right side of the board to go to here. Right? There's no square on the right side on the next file. And so, opposition doesn't provide any such advantage. If we play something like h4 here, trying to give black the ability to make a move, well, it's still just stalemate. And so, unfortunately for the attacking side, the end result here is always going to be stalemate. One weird scenario I haven't talked about yet is the following position. In this position, both kings are protecting their pawns while attacking their opponent's pawns. However, neither king can move without losing their side's pawn, and therefore losing the game. For example, if it's white's turn here, king g4, king takes e4. The more general concept of both sides not wanting to be the player to make the move is called zugzwang, spelled Zugzwang. And you may recognize this concept from opposition earlier. For positions like these, both sides should try to force the other to be the first one to put their kings on these squares so that they can respond in kind. So, for example, if we go back and put the kings on g5 and c4 instead, and it's white's move, if white goes king f5, they lose because king d4 and white is in zugzwang. Instead, though, white should go king f6. Now, if black tries to mirror and plays king d3, white will capture the pawn and protect their own. So black's only choice is to go king d4, but after king f5, black is in zugzwang, they must move the king away, and white wins. We'll go over just one more position, and that's the position where there are connected passed pawns on the 6th and 7th rank. Now, if the pawns were further back, you could use the second pawn to gain the opposition and win. If the pawns are further apart, you could use the second pawn to promote while the king is distracted by the first. However, in the situation where connected passed pawns are on the 6th and 7th rank specifically, neither of those plans are possible, and the situation can be even bleaker if pawns are on the edge of the board, as they are here, as now if our king ever controls the g7 square, we'll end up stalemating black's king. And yet, white here can still win. The question is, how? If you want a hint, we'll once again utilize our good friend opposition. Pause the video and unpause when you're ready. Alright, so again, the situation looks a little bleak. Our opponent seemingly can just endlessly shuffle between g7 and h8. And if we ever try to move in with our king in any sort of way, we'll end up controlling g7, and therefore we will be causing stalemate. If we sacrifice our g-pawn, our opponent can take the pawn, and their king is still going to be in the square of the h-pawn, and we'll be able to stop it. So there's only one option left. If our g-pawn won't work and our king won't work, then the only answer left is our h-pawn. So here we have to wait until our opponent moves their king to g7, and then sacrifice the h-pawn, h8 making a queen. Now the defending side must take, and we can now seize our chance to gain the opposition with king h6. Black's only move is king g8, and after g7, we'll be able to force them out and make a queen. So to recap, we went over two concepts, the square rule and opposition. We then applied those principles to analyze some king and pawn endgames and determine whether or not the side with the pawn should be able to win. And finally, we took a closer look in some unique scenarios and puzzles to see how initial impressions given by those rules could be overruled by the specific quirks of the position. Now, all of the winning scenarios ended with the side with the pawn promoting to a queen. However, if you're relatively new to the game, you may not be entirely familiar with how to convert a queen advantage into a checkmate. If that's the case, feel free to also check out our previous endgame video, which talked about general endgame principles and some basic checkmates. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next class.